Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
Today we're talking about Enneagram ethics.
Very important theme for obvious reasons. And also it may be fun because we are going to share with you some hints on how to share the Enneagram with other people and how not to.
You know, I think this is a very important topic. I'm not sure if it's fun, but I think we'll try to make it interesting and hopefully a bit fun as well. And of course, if you're someone who's kind of turned off by this topic, doesn't think it's very interesting, maybe you're the one that needs to listen to this the most. So when we're talking about Enneagram ethics, we're referring to the fact that the Enneagram is a powerful tool. It has ancient roots. It addresses psychological and spiritual growth, and it can be quite vulnerable for people to find their type, to work with it, and even to talk about it with other people. Why else do you think it's important to talk about Enneagram ethics, Uranio?
As you said, it brings people to a vulnerable space when they find out the reasons why they do what they do. The Enneagram is not exactly a theory of traits, of behavior. It talks more about what is behind behavior, the motivations. And it's, sometimes when Enneagram books describe types, people have a reaction saying, how does this author know me? I didn't know I know them. So it's really interesting to see how sometimes we try to hide away from others our secrets of why we do what we do, right? So when we bring the Enneagram to other people, talking about motivation, it's sort of deep. And we need to understand that this brings people to vulnerable spaces. And there are emotions involved in finding out type, in dealing with type, and a normal resistance that we all have to let some patterns go. But it's also a psycho-spiritual system. And both psychology and spirituality require higher levels of concern with ethics, don't you think, Bea?
Yes, I do. I do. And like you're saying, I think when people learn their Enneagram type, they can immediately feel quite exposed. And so that's one reason we need to be careful when we even talk about it in an informal way. Also, when I travel around teaching the Enneagram, a lot of people say to me, please talk about ethics in regard to the Enneagram, because it is an important thing to discuss, because we see what happens when people aren't mindful about being careful about the way they talk about the types, about the way they use it with people, and when they practice some form of teaching or work with the Enneagram without being fully on a self-development path themselves. So for many reasons, I think it's important to talk about this topic. And also it's why I included it in an early chapter of my book, The 9 Types of Leadership. We always need to be reminding each other and ourselves about what we need to do to be very mindful, very thoughtful, and very careful when we work with something as revealing and as powerful in so many ways as the Enneagram system.
Right. And it's not the Enneagram, but any typology brings this mindset of putting things and people in categories. And it's quite important when we use typologies to talk about prejudices and biases that we all have when dealing with, typologies. I worked for over 20 years as an organizational consultant using the Enneagram. So whenever I brought the Enneagram to teams, I would talk about some guidelines that people needed to follow so that we could minimize that risk of people talking about other people's types, or as if there was a type that's better than other, which doesn't exist.
Yeah, no one wants to be put in a box. No one wants to be pigeonholed. And of course, the Enneagram brings up those concerns as soon as you start talking about it when people are new to it and haven't heard about it before. Now, of course, we've always learned to say when someone says the Enneagram puts me in a box, to say to them, the Enneagram doesn't put you in a box. You're already in a box. You just don't know it. The Enneagram helps you understand the dimensions of the box that you're in so that you can get out of your box. But all that said, let's turn to some specific topics to frame our discussion around what are the specific things we want to be thinking about when we talk about Enneagram ethics. What are the areas of concern that we need to be aware of? And the first thing I would say, and I want to ask you about, is typing. So typing, of course, can be a difficult process because, different Enneagram types look alike. Different Enneagram types describe blind spots. So I always tell people it's important to look at finding your type as a process. But of course, once someone gets very interested and excited about the Enneagram, it's natural to want to walk around telling everyone what type they are. So, what would you say we need to think about in terms of ethics and ethical behavior when we're either just walking around the world talking about the Enneagram or when we're working with others to help them find their type?
I learned the Enneagram in 1996. And as soon as I learned it, I started studying it very much. And I think my type 5, has a little bit of a bias to becoming a bit arrogant. On one hand, we think that we still don't know all we want or need to know, but on the other hand, we feel like we know a lot. So what happened with me is that it didn't take long for me to feel like I could identify everybody's types. I couldn't watch anything on TV without thinking of the person's type. And I would, whenever I talked about the Enneagram with someone, I would suggest what I thought the person's type is. And, I think that we need to become much more senior in our capacities and knowledge of the Enneagram to be more humble. It's sort of normal that we think of everybody's types in the beginning, but the more we go, the more we understand how complex all this is. First, we can talk about type only, right? We talk about subtypes, we talk about instinctual sequences, levels of awareness, and other things that change what we see in people. Now, also, we need to know that only the person can know their own type. It's not possible for us to be sure at any moment. Like, only the person can be sure about their own type. So, the best thing is to share Enneagram knowledge, help the person narrow down possibilities, knowing that a few would be really improbable, and then allow the person to make their own choice. What is your thought about this?
Well, I've heard a lot of stories from people who told me that when they first learned the Enneagram, someone told them what type they were in a way that wasn't very, let's say, elegant. And they got turned off to the Enneagram and they didn't come back to it for several years. And so I think this is a story that we hear a lot that we need to take as a cautionary tale. It's, again, I can't say enough how natural it is when you're excited about the Enneagram to want to share it and to want to inform other people what you think their type is, especially if you think it's really obvious or if you really want to have that person be interested in the Enneagram so you can connect with them through it. But I think it's often really hard to see how we come across when we do that. So if you say to someone, "Oh, I just learned the Enneagram and I think you're a 1 and here's why," it's easy to overlook what that can feel like to someone on the receiving end. So I think for one thing, it's kind of like what you said. One thing I think we always really honor in the way we handle the issue of typing is to never say categorically or with any certainty that you know what type someone else is. Now, it puts us as teachers a little bit in a bind, because when we teach retreats and workshops and people come, let's say they come in thinking they're a type, and from what we observe in them, we think they have their type wrong. That can be a little bit tricky, right? And so what you and I have thought about a lot, and what we do is we say that we will express our doubts as teachers when we think that someone doesn't have their type right. However, we will never say we know for certain. We will never say that we know better than the person who knows themselves the best. However, we will express that doubt, and we will try to open up space for exploration. What else would you say about ethics around typing specifically, either for the enthusiast or for the person who teaches or works with the Enneagram?
An ethical point for me, not only about typing, but for everything regarding the Enneagram, is knowing that it's complex and you need to study it a lot. When it comes to typing, you need to know how you can be deceived by subtype matters. But everything connected to the Enneagram is complex, and you need to study hard. Sometimes we just say, oh, the 9 types. Yeah, okay. But it's not that simple. So study. And the more you study, the more interested you get. And the best you do this job of spreading the word about this wonderful system. And by the way, I think we are here talking not only to Enneagram practitioners, but also to any Enneagram enthusiast who spreads the word, who talks about the Enneagram to other people. And sometimes inadvertently, we just, indirectly have prejudices about one or another type. Or we think someone is of a certain type because of the wrong reasons, or because of our judgment of that person. Not to mention that sometimes if we like someone, we would like that person to be the same type we are. Or if we don't like that person, we will not admit that the person is the same type we are. So it's complex.
Yes. So I think the things I would highlight about typing and being ethical with with handling the Enneagram is I want to highlight some of the things you said and add a couple more. One is you've got to study the Enneagram a lot before you should express opinions about somebody's type. Exactly like Uranio was saying, a lot of people, for instance, don't know, they aren't familiar with the approach to the subtypes that we use that comes from Claudio Naranjo. And understanding the 27 subtypes, the 3 versions of each of the 9 types, it adds a lot in terms of understanding the complexity. Understanding that there are counter types that don't look like the main type. That's important to know, because it accounts for a lot of incorrect opinions that get expressed about somebody's type. So there are a lot of reasons why to avoid. It's better to avoid telling someone what type they are, especially with any level of certainty, especially if they don't ask you, especially if you haven't really understood at a deeper level what motivates them. And I think all of that points to my next point, which is it's important to be humble. Sometimes when we have our first stage of learning the Enneagram and we learn everything about it, we can, again, get excited and want to express our opinion and lose our humility. And so I think being humble about how much you know is a good thing. I often feel good when I hear people say, I've been spending a lot more time learning about the Enneagram, and now I realize how much I don't know. And I think that kind of awareness of how much you don't know is good. And of course, like you said, we all have biases. And I think what this can do is it can make us talk about some of the types in ways that we don't see those biases. And we can talk about some of the types using language that is hurtful. For instance, I have a good friend who is an 8, and she has frequently told me that at Enneagram workshops, at Enneagram events, she'll talk to people at these events, and the way they talk to her about 8s, her own type, is quite brutal. They'll say some things that are quite insensitive about how 8s are bullies, just some really negative language used to treat 8s where it really hurts her. And I thought this is such an important thing that she was bringing, because again, we all get caught up in these stereotypes where maybe we think 8s are insensitive, and we stop being sensitive in the way that we speak about 8s. So I think it's always very important to have empathy for other people and for all the types, and to be very careful about the way we speak about the types, and especially expressing any kind of opinion with any kind of certainty about what type somebody else is. Any last thing you would add to that before we move on to a slightly different topic?
Oh, just that this 8 was not a bully. She was being bullied herself. And Enneagram bullying happens more than we think, especially on the internet, where people are perhaps too concerned with typing public people on, telling jokes about types. It's totally fine to do so, but provided that you take care about not being a bully yourself. Now, that also reminds me of a very, very important ethical thing of not becoming an instant expert. What happens with the Enneagram right now is a big growth across the planet. And we notice, you and I travel a lot, B, and we notice how some people who don't really know the Enneagram well simply start teaching it as if they knew it. What do you think about this? And what can we do about this, B, and from an ethical perspective?
Well, I think this moves into the next topic I was thinking of discussing with you, which is, if you want to work with the Enneagram, if you want to teach the Enneagram, or even write about the Enneagram, or do some sort of work with the Enneagram, like teaching or coaching or therapy, things like this, I think there are a whole list of ethical topics to be discussed. And I think what you're putting your finger on is the very most important first one, which is, if you're interested in the Enneagram and you feel a calling to work with the Enneagram, that's great, but try not to take it lightly. Realize that in order to really work with it in a deep way, which is always how the Enneagram should be worked with, you need to get a lot of training. That if you take a weekend workshop, it's not enough to work with it in any way. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I think more than anything else, if you're going to work with the Enneagram, or even, talk about it beyond the level of informal weekend enthusiast, I think it's really important to be using it for your own self-development in a serious way. And I think people don't really always realize that this is an absolute requirement. The Enneagram is a self-development tool. It's a profound system. And if you are going to be using it to help people rise above the ego, you better be doing everything you can to be working on using it to rise above your ego. Anything else that you would say about that? And again, I think well, first thing I want to say before I hand it over to you, which I want to hear your thoughts on this, is I think people get, and I see this a lot in social media, they get really caught up in diagnosing versus doing real development. And what I mean by that is finding their type, finding their instinctual sequence or their subtype, finding their tri-type, finding their wings. And they'll say all that, and it's a long list of stuff that points to description. But I always wonder, if they're looking at so many different aspects of diagnosis, doesn't that create confusion? And what really are you doing to actually use it for your development? I think we can get distracted by the description, the diagnosis, the information, and it can keep us from really doing the deep developmental work, which we absolutely need to be doing if we're working with the Enneagram or even talking about it in any serious way. So
Yeah.
what do you think?
I actually think that sometimes the excess of creativity by Enneagram teachers and practitioners is a little bit dangerous, because instead of following what the classic teachers and authors have said, they try to come up with something new that is not very much based in reality or not very sound. So creating Enneagram theory or spreading Enneagram theory, it needs to be taken seriously. Another thing I want to say, B, is that people not only shouldn't be instant experts on the Enneagram, but they need to study more their areas of practice or expertise. I mean, if you talk to people in business, go study a bit more about it. Or if you talk about the psychology behind the Enneagram, you also need to study it well, don't you think?
I do. And I think when people are, as you say, being creative with Enneagram theory, I think sometimes that's about ego. It's about, I want to put my original stamp on this, or I want to be an authority. And so I have an ego need to say something new about the Enneagram. And sometimes people don't really see, is it really helping further Enneagram theory, or is it more about your ego need to be an Enneagram expert? And again, I think we're talking about delicate things here, but it's very important because I think, again, this is a system designed to help us see our egos in action and rise above them and move beyond them as best we can. And of course, it's a constant practice, always trying to learn to do that. But especially when we're working with the Enneagram and we're conferring some authority on ourselves, or we're wanting to say something important. And again, that can be a good thing. It's important to always be checking our ego. Where is this coming from? For instance, recently I read an Enneagram book, and in my view, and this is just my opinion, but my sense was this author was recounting or restating some Enneagram theories that have been out there for a while, and then putting their own twist on it, or putting a spin on it to make it theirs a little bit, or to say, here's something I'm going to add to this. And my question would be, well, what's the purpose of that? Is there proof that you're really enhancing the effectiveness of this theory and the way we use the Enneagram? Are you helping people use the Enneagram in better ways? Or is there some ego need to put your stamp on the Enneagram or do something with it that's new or different? Because oftentimes when I like the way you're putting it very generously, this creativity with Enneagram theory. I would also say sort of a desire to bring forth an original spin on Enneagram theory. I think we need to be really, really looking at, does this help people help themselves grow? Does this improve the way we work with the Enneagram in clear ways? And if not, then I think we need to sort of hold up a mirror to ourselves or ask for feedback from the people in our environment and realize, well, maybe this is my need. Maybe this is my ego talking. And again, once again, it comes back to humility. When we're working with the Enneagram, we need to be very humble about what our role is, what we can do and not do, what is ours to do and not to do.
Right. What else do you think, B, is another layer of Enneagram ethics?
Well, I do think, and you alluded to this, that Claudio Naranjo used to say the Enneagram is not a standalone tool. Oftentimes, we need to embed it in other methods, as when people use it along with meditation, or in therapy, or as a business consultant, as a tool that you use with teams, or as a coach or a spiritual director. And the point here is that in that case, you need to be good at not only working with the Enneagram, which means you need to get the requisite training and have a lot of experience working with the Enneagram and understanding the Enneagram itself. And you also need to be improving your skill in whatever area you work in. You need to have a lot of expertise and authority as a therapist or a coach or a spiritual director or a business consultant. And you need to, and the more ethical you are in your practice, in your area of expertise, in the field in which you work, the more you'll be able to apply that to the Enneagram work. Let's do a short break.
The Enneagram 2.0 podcast goes live every other Thursday on all main platforms. Stay tuned to learn more about yourself and others.
Bea and Uranio offer much more high-quality Enneagram content on www.cpenneagram.com. If you are an Enneagram enthusiast, visit the website now.
Hello, it's me, Uranio. Just to tell you that Bea and I launched a new online workshop called the Enneagram Masterclass. It's a 6-hour video course that you can access at cpenneagram.com. You can go at your own pace and have lifetime access to it. Many beginner students have already watched it, but advanced students can also learn about the 9 types in a deeper way. We can't wait for you to check it out. Get $75 off your purchase by using code ChestnutPaes75 on cpenneagram.com.
Okay, another area I would like to explore with you is shadows. Now, one of the things the Enneagram teaches us the most, I think, is that we all have blind spots and shadows. And in our daily waking life, when we're identified with our personality, we're often very unaware of these shadows. So when it comes to working with the Enneagram or even talking about the Enneagram, what would you say people need to be aware of in terms of their shadows in order to be ethical in the way they work with the Enneagram?
Yes, so because the Enneagram is powerful, because it relates to therapeutic work and also spiritual work, we need to talk about shadows. And first, let me recommend a book. It's not very well known, but it's called Power in the Helping Professionals by Adolf Guggenbol Craig, a Swiss author. When we are teachers, when we are therapists, when we are spiritual directors, we are in a very delicate position that we may become vain about. And people depend on us more and put us in pedestals, and that is very dangerous. Now, when we explore our shadows, we take hold of the process and we do a better job in not allowing our shadows to run us. We control them more. Like when we are teachers, we want to say what we think, and we can't show that we don't know what the person's type is. Or as a therapist, the person asks us for an opinion, and sometimes the therapist says things. Or when it's also a spiritual director, it might be dangerous. So exploring the unconscious attachment to power that we have when we are on those positions, it's very important. Now, when you are not a practitioner, but you know the Enneagram, you might also have power shadows. Like, wow, now I know this wonderful system, and I'll talk to my friends who not always praise me, and I will tell them what types they are. That's also power shadow. And we need to be really aware of it. So good ways to deal with it is by asking questions instead of making affirmations, is to position yourself as an eternal student. Like you and I are still students, aren't we, Bea?
Yes.
Enneagram students, not only teachers. We are always trying to renew our knowledge. We don't think at all that we know everything about the Enneagram. So this kind of humility is needed. And we need to examine the biases that we have because we come from a specific profession. All professions have biases and particular shadows. And maybe teachers and spiritual directors and therapists have even more shadows. If we don't pay attention to that, that's dangerous. And the Enneagram, unfortunately, invites for big shadows in us because we come to a position of power when we know so much about someone by knowing what type the person is. If we don't deal responsibly with that, that may result in bad things.
Yes, I agree. I think this topic of shadows points directly to the importance of, again, always doing your own inner development work and doing this with other people as well, because we all need feedback. It's really hard for us to see our own shadows. And so I think we need to ask for feedback. Like you said, we need to be always in a position of learning and having beginner's mind and being open minded to the thoughts of others. I think when we're consuming Enneagram information, whether we're reading books or deciding what workshop or retreat or event to go to, it's always important to check the credentials of the person doing the Enneagram work. I think oftentimes in the Enneagram world, that doesn't happen so much. It's like if someone's charismatic or a powerful speaker or funny and entertaining, we can kind of attribute authority to that person in terms of Enneagram skill and knowledge that they don't have, partly because they sound really good, or we like them, or we like something about their approach. And so, again, I think there's also something as consumers, we need to be watching out for this ethical issue. Are we holding teachers and authors and people who would speak for the Enneagram to account in terms of the way they're talking about it, the way they're treating it, the way they use it with other people? And by the way, you and I, as teachers, we talk a lot about the way that people, when they work with us, they put a lot of trust in us. And the Enneagram is often deployed in contexts where people are developing. And this is a delicate process. As we've said, it often involves people being open and vulnerable and seeking some new information or seeking some new positive experience, and opening up to that is something that is very precious. And so we always, when we're working with the Enneagram, we need to take our role and our responsibility extremely seriously in recognizing we're dealing with people's psyches here. We're often we're having people put their trust in us. We're having people be open and curious to learn something new about themselves and the way they are in the world. And so we need to be aware of any shadows that brings up with us about sort of being an authority. As you say, the power shadow of being someone who is in a position to bring new information to people that can help them. And often when you bring new information to people and it changes their life, and even in a small way, there can be a lot of gratitude. And again, people can confer positive attributes onto you because of the Enneagram. I think we all borrow credibility from the Enneagram system itself. That sometimes maybe isn't about us, but that's really about the power of the system. And again, I think over and over again, I think we need to point to things like, asking questions, being eternal students, as you said, relying on sources that we trust in our teaching and that are truly authoritative, not doing any kind of bypass of the development work that we absolutely need to do ourselves in order to not only be good messengers about the Enneagram, but also to model the work that people necessarily need to do when they incorporate the Enneagram into their lives. So what else would you say? Anything else you would add?
Just two quick comments. I always like to give feedback to teachers, to therapists, and see how they handle the feedback. What I observe is that people who have not worked on their power shadows cannot handle getting feedback very well. While people who have done some work appreciate getting feedback, even if they are in any power position. Now, another thing, just to mention this, we'll talk about this some other time here on the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I just want to mention that the power shadow is even more tricky for whoever is social dominant on the Enneagram instinctual sequence. We have three instincts: self-preservation, sexual, social. And when we are social dominants like me, we have more of a trouble with power shadows. Meaning that we want to be the ones we like unconsciously to be in pedestals and to be really attached to power, to be the ones. And all of us, even if we are not social dominants, we need to see that. But social dominants need to do it even more. We sometimes associate the social dominant instinct with a God complex. So all of that is worth examining. And if we don't do this kind of work, why would we be interested in self-development at all?
Yes, I think you raised some excellent points. One example I want to cite of this thing you said about feedback, and in this, I don't want to hold us up as the models for taking in feedback well. I think you and I are very dedicated to this, and we're works in progress. And it's always hard to hear critical feedback. I want to say that. But there was a time I'm thinking of when we were doing a workshop, and there was a woman who came up to us. She was an 8, actually, and she had some very critical feedback. She was having a difficult experience. It was hard. So she was sort of saying that the workshop wasn't working for her. And, we really just took it in. We listened, we empathized, we validated her, her experience. And the next day she had a huge opening. And I gave her a lot of credit for coming forward with this feedback she had for us. But I think if we had gotten defensive and not really fully heard her out and really understood what she was saying, I think there would have been a block that wouldn't have allowed her to go deeper. So I think feedback is so important. Another thing I want to mention is something that we will probably talk about in other places, and I think we've mentioned before, but is the idea of the spiritual bypass. And I think this happens with a lot of Enneagram teachers, especially Enneagram teachers in the spiritual space, where they may have a lot of power and capability and experience in spiritual work, but they haven't done all their psychological work. So one of the things the Enneagram really helps us understand is when we're on a developmental path that's framed and supported by the Enneagram as a map of development, we need to do both psychological work and spiritual work. And especially if you're a spiritual practitioner, you will need to do your psychological work, because there are a lot of examples in the world out there of spiritual teachers who haven't done all of their psychological work and become dangerous to the people that they work with. Because again, their egos are just they're not on top of observing and understanding what's happening with their ego and how that may get acted out. And again, we act things out when we're not aware enough of our shadows.
Yeah, I agree, B. And I think this is very important nowadays in all places. But I also want to say something different about this. I believe that it's also unethical when someone uses the Enneagram just in practical ways, doing applications, without acknowledging that it's a deep, deep psycho-spiritual transformational tool or system, not tool. There are many times that I get really frustrated when I see teachers and practitioners completely disregarding that deeper aspect of the Enneagram, as if it was not connected to deep psycho-spiritual methods. And I also want to say that it's unethical to do so. Look, you don't need to talk about this yourself. You don't need to bring in language that will make your work harder in specific places that you work at. But if you don't embody that for yourself, if you don't acknowledge that this tool is not any tool, then you'll be not very ethical.
So I think some people out there may have questions about what you just said, because some people may say, well, what if I'm an atheist? What if I'm not spiritual and I want to use the Enneagram in business, let's say, or it's just as a practical tool? Isn't that okay? You're saying that's unethical? I want to ask you, because I think people who listen to this may have that question.
Excellent question. Thank you for asking this. What I think is that regardless of your beliefs, you need to be open to studying all the dimensions of the Enneagram. And Gurdjieff, as perhaps the main Enneagram pioneer ever, he used to say, don't believe me, but try it out. Have your own experiences. What I think is that it's not very ethical to try to be in touch with only some dimensions of the Enneagram and disregard completely the other dimensions. Try it out and then see for yourself if it works or not, if it activates something new in you or not. I actually like to teach people who are more skeptical. But all I ask is, can you stay open to testing, to verifying what your actual experience will be? So that position is being humble for me, and that is ethical. What is not ethical is just not trying to do anything and then working with the Enneagram, or talking against dimensions of the Enneagram that are so important and that would go against even the origins of this system. So it's tricky, but this is my thought.
So hopefully this discussion about Enneagram ethics has at least helped people understand how important it is to think in terms of this dimension, that the Enneagram is a complex tool, that it's very deep, that it has the power, a lot of power to open up personal, vulnerable processes for people. And so it should be handled with great care, even in the most informal of discussions. And I guess last thing I want to say before I ask you if you have one last thing you want to say, is that, and it goes a little bit to what you were just saying, that I think it's important for people to understand that the Enneagram has a lot of depth to it and a lot of complexity. And that even if you're not speaking about it with all that complexity in mind, to have a sense that it's there, to treat it with care, to be gentle in the way that you introduce it to people, even when you're very enthusiastic and it's helped you a lot. To be very mindful and empathic with the people who might be on the receiving end of anything you might say about the Enneagram, and to just know that it's a potent thing, and we need to, like all powerful things, be very humble and mindful in the way that we speak about it, in the way that we work with it. Any last things you would say about this?
Yeah, I just loved what you've just said. And in my view, we don't use the Enneagram uses us. We don't find the Enneagram, it finds us. And when that happens, we really get in touch with the depth of the system. And we need to be aware that a lot of inner movement is happening. So we need to be extremely sensitive to that.
Yes. And if you feel called to work with the Enneagram, that's a great thing. But I hope you see that one of the perks of working with the Enneagram, one of the positives, is that it requires you to do your inner development work. And to me, that's a good thing. I always used to say that when I was a psychotherapist, one of the positives about being a psychotherapist is I had no choice. I needed to be on a self-development path because I needed to be able to get myself and my own ego out of the way of the people that I was working with, so that I could be very ethical and honoring of the process of someone else. So it's time for our top 5. What's the top 5 today?
The top 5 types that are most mindful of boundaries. Boundaries, yes. We thought this could be a good theme for the podcast. We talked about ethics. It doesn't mean, though, that there are types that are more ethical or less ethical, because this has a lot more to do with values and background and so on. But what is your 5th, B?
Well, before we say that, I just want to define boundaries a little bit. I think we're talking about both physical boundaries and psychological boundaries. And if you're not a psychotherapist, you may not have thought about this in great depth. But basically, we're talking both about respecting other people's right to say no, or their ability to share or not share things like that. So we're talking both about like having personal space, let's say, but also having psychological safety. So my 5th is 4s. And I'm not really going with a subtype here, although I might lean in the direction of self-preservation 4 if I was pressed to choose a subtype. And I think it's because 4s tend to be tuned into emotions, and they tend to have a certain level of emotional intelligence. And oftentimes that allows them to have kind of a deeper sensitivity to what people need around things like boundaries. So I thought self-pres 4 or 4 generally would be my number 5. What about you? What's your number 5?
My 5 is 3s. You know, I was in a doubt between 4s and 3s for number 5, and I decided to have 3s instead of 4. And I believe that 3s preserve individual spaces naturally well, most of the time. I think there may be other components, including instincts, that change this, not only for 3s. But to me, 3s are usually not very interested in invading people's spaces, and they're good in that. Not the best, but good. What is your number 4, B?
My number 4 is 3s. For much the same reason you said. I guess I think of 3s as being very task-focused. They can be very oriented toward paying attention to the certain things that are on the more practical level. And I think because of that, I think of 3s as being fairly boundaried and being aware of that in what they do.
Right, okay. Yeah, my number 4 is 6s. I think that 6s are pretty good in terms of boundaries usually. There may be, exceptions and a few cases that 6s are not that good. Sometimes sexual 6s might not be as good as the other 6s. But I think that usually 6s have good examples to tell about keeping boundaries for themselves and for others. What is your 3rd?
My number 3 is self-preservation 8s. I think self-preservation 8s tend to be more self-contained than other 8s, and I think it's almost like they focus a lot on what they're doing, and they don't necessarily need to get involved in what other people are doing. So I think of self-preservation 8s as both being more boundaried and also respecting others' boundaries to a good degree. What's your number 3?
My number 3 is 5s. I think that there are some natural aspects of type 5 that make it easier for them to have boundaries. There is something interesting I want to say as a 5 myself. I actually don't think that 5s are good in building boundaries. Not at all. Because the kind of boundary that comes from personality for 5s is natural. 5s don't need to build boundaries. So it's interesting that I don't see myself having had as much experience as friends of other types of putting efforts in building boundaries for myself and for others. And when I started changing, transforming, I had to face my lack of experience in building boundaries myself, boundaries that were not the simple wall that I had because of avarice, the passion of type 5. But still, if we think that 5s have, avarice as the passion and they build boundaries well, then I think it's good to include 5s, and 5s are my number 3.
So my number 2 is 1s. And in this top 5, I did mix up subtypes and types a little bit. My number 5 is 4s, my number 4 is 3s, my number 3 is self-preservation 8s, and my number 2 is 1s. I think of 1s as being very concerned with being appropriate. They tend to be more self-sufficient. They tend to be practical and respectful of other people's space. And I think part of it was having grown up with 2 1s in my household. I came to think of both of the 1s that I lived with in my family as being fairly well boundaried and also being people who are respectful of boundaries. So 1s is my number 2.
Interesting, because 1s are also my number 2. And for the very same reasons that you mentioned. Notice that in my view, 1s are even better than 5s. So I'm curious to see, what is your number 1?
One more thing I want to say about 1s is I think part of seeing 1s as good with boundaries is in my family, my family of origin, there were 4 of us in the immediate nuclear family, me and my brother and my parents, and there were 2 1s and 2 2s. And so I think part of admiring and appreciating 1s being good with boundaries is noticing the contrast between the 1s and the 2s in my family. So 2s aren't as good with boundaries, but the 1s are good, especially in comparison. So my number 1 is self-preservation 5. And I think similar to what you were saying, the issue with 5s and boundaries can be a little complicated. And I appreciate what you said. And I think a lot of people may not have really understood that before, the sort of complexity around 5s versus what is natural, what is kind of just an unconscious pattern. It's part of the personality versus being more mindful of building boundaries or the need to create boundaries. This is why I did choose self-preservation 5 for my number 1, because I think one of the main focuses of self-preservation 5s is boundaries. And I think sometimes they just erect them naturally. It's just part of their way of being. But I think other times they can be very attentive to them, especially around them needing them. But I think it's one of those things that often you give people what you also need from people. And I just know one of my best friends is a self-preservation 5, and she talks a lot about not wanting to be indebted to or too connected to or too involved with certain people, partly because she wants to have the option of not being so involved and connected herself. So I think because of this, I think of her as someone who's very mindful of boundaries, when she needs to be able to say no to things, when she wants to allow other people to say no. And I think even just being in relationship with her over the years has helped me learn that it's okay to have a boundary myself.
Okay, so are you curious to know what my number 1 is, given that I've already mentioned 1s, 5s?
I am very curious, yes.
Okay, my number 1 is any type that the person is self-preservation dominant and sexual repressed in the instinctual sequence.
Oh, very tricky of you.
Yes, tricky, because I do think that instincts here play a big role for boundaries, and sometimes even more than type itself. And I think that self-preservation dominant people are naturally more boundaried, and also that sexual dominant people are less boundaried. So if the person is self-preservation dominant and sexual repressed, and this has to do with what we call the instinctual sequence, then I think this person is the champion. But of course, it will be much more so if we're talking about a 5 or a 1 with this particular instinctual sequence instead of another type. I also want to say that socials are not particularly well boundaried, and we mentioned this on the podcast. But I think that for boundaries, it's more important to say that sexuals might intrude upon people and, not have as many boundaries, or even be what we call an energy sponge more easily. That's what I see mostly in people.
I think it's interesting that you had that as your number one. It's tricky, but interesting. And I think it will give a lot of people food for thought. I will say this, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I like that you brought up this instinctual sequence in terms of having boundaries as something to think about. I will say that is my instinctual sequence, and I'm a 2, and historically, I've not had good boundaries. So it's interesting because I will think more about what you said, and I don't disagree with it, but I will say that I've been really blind to boundaries much of my life. So in my case, being a 2 may outweigh the instinctual sequence. In fact, when I became a therapist, one of the good things about my training and that experience was I learned to have boundaries for the first time and how important they are and what they are and how to do it. So that's my comment. Any last comment on your part?
I want to comment on your comment. I think that you're most probably much better with boundaries than other 2s. So when you compare yourself with them, you might see that you're better because of this instinctual sequence. But I know it's all debatable. And you know what I really think is the best possible person with boundaries, even better than this my number 1. I think it's the person who operates in a high level of awareness. Don't you think?
Yes, I do. I think one of the key things about psychological development is learning about boundaries and learning what boundaries you need and how you may need to give more room for other people to make boundaries. I think that is an important part of psychological health and self-awareness. So I think that's a really good point to end on. Thank you for listening, and join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.